And welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Communications and Media with ABWE, joined again, as always, by my good friend and partner in crime, co-host of the show, Scott Dunford, pastor in Fremont, California at Western Hills Church. Actually, we'll have to talk some more at some point in the future about your new ministry, Scott, but trust that you've been doing well. For our listeners, only a week has passed, but for us, it's been a little while since we've been here in the studio together. And so how are things going for you, brother?
Hey, it's always good in California. The weather's always perfect, and the ministry is always abundant. So I'm never going to run out of things to do out here. So praise the Lord.
That is a
for
glass half full way of looking at your mission field, my friend, and I appreciate that outlook. And we're also joined by another friend of ours who we've been trying to make this conversation work for a little while. And so, Scott, I'll ask you to introduce him in just a moment. But I don't know about you, Scott. For me, early when I was starting out serving in various ministries and in church contexts, I ran into conversation about spiritual gifts. I was taken through quizzes and inventories, and the question was posed, what do you feel like your talents are, your spiritual gifts, and how can you use them? That's about as deep as I ever went in that topic. And when it comes to using our gifts on the mission field, I don't always find that the topic of spiritual gifts actually plays out in most conversations about where do you use those gifts globally. And so I'm really excited to have what might be kind of a basic conversation, but it's foundational. And we always have to be returning to the foundations, the topic of spiritual gifts and how that affects the way we engage the Great Commission. So Scott, can you introduce who's joining us today?
Yeah, we have an old friend, someone that I've known for many years here in ministry, David Rogers. I think we met for the first time down in Ecuador, and we've stayed in touch since then. And he's got a new book coming. Well, first of all, let me say he's been a long-time missionary. When I say long time, I think it's something close to over 43 years, I believe, serving with ABWE. He doesn't look that old, but I think he started when he was 10. And so, and he's also the president of Ministerio Cristiano, or CRECE. It's a Spanish language Christian publishing house. He's also the author of a new book, which is what we're going to be talking about, called Spiritual Gifts, Identifying Them Through the PRIZM, PRIZM, of God's Grace. So, David, we're so glad to have you here. Tell us a little bit about your ministry and what prompted you to write a book on spiritual gifts.
Well, good day to you guys. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Alex, for having me on. Scott, for that good introduction. I don't want to tell stories about what happened in Ecuador. Remember, what happened in Ecuador stays in Ecuador.
That's right.
That was a long time ago. It's kind of hard to believe. It's such a joy to be able to share with you men here today in the podcast. Well, the Lord has put this burden on my heart actually as a result of church planting. And probably many of our listeners I'm thinking, can identify with that for the simple reason that you just can't build a new church from the ground level up if it's not really clear to the believers how they're going to be a part of that, how they're going to fit in, how they're going to make that thing function. We are serving in church planting in Santiago, Chile, but have been doing that in a parallel way, right along with the training, the teaching, the mentoring, and also partnering with national church planters to develop the formation of new churches as well as church planting churches. And so the whole concept of spiritual gifts became very, very, I guess you could call it very kind of needy or urgent or pressing when we were working on our second church. We had been serving there by that time about 10 years in Chile, a little over, starting into a second church plant. We did that because a colleague, an ABWE colleague, invited us to join he and his wife and children in the center of the city, downtown Santiago. So it was a kind of a transition point. What's probably not normal, and maybe not all of our church planting colleagues could identify with, was I actually had 2 years to get ready for the next church plant. 1 year on furlough, and then another year to pick where we would, or to decide where we would do that church plant. And so as we were getting ready to start that second church plant in the center city of Santiago, downtown there, it became really clear that the ministry of preparing people to do church planting isn't just teaching them how to share the gospel. I don't want to minimize that. It's not just talking about, as it were, their faith, but it's about the church, what the local church is. So the missionary colleague and I'll mention his name in a letter. Although he didn't mention, he's not in the book, but he did give me a lot of encouragement in the book. He talked with me about this. He said, we've got to start out with a clear understanding for all of our church members and church attenders as to what they're going to be doing in this local church. And part of the reason was because of the location. We were located very close to another very, very large church in Chile, a church that was actually at that time over 100,000 people. We're talking in the year 2000, 23 years ago. And what happened was, out of that big, I guess you want to call it sort of a evangelical church, there was a kind of a constant spillover of people visiting us. And so as they would come, they would ask questions, most of which were doctrinal questions.
An important question as we get started in this is, what are spiritual gifts? How do you define them, David? And more importantly, how does the Bible define them?
Great question. Great question. And that's really what we had to start doing as we thought about this and prayed about it and studied. What is a spiritual gift? The Bible uses two words. There's two Greek terms in the New Testament. One is sort of like what you and I might consider parallel with a present, like a birthday present. But it has to do really more with the act of giving versus the gift itself. The other word that most people have probably heard is another word that means the gift or the gift itself, or as it were, a donation, a present, as it were, a granting of something. And that's the word that we call charisma, which we often talk about because we've heard that word in so many different contexts. The two words basically put together a top and a bottom or two-sided picture of the same thing. And that is, a spiritual gift is something that God in His grace has chosen to give us as a manifestation, or if you want to call it, a demonstration of His grace. And the other side of that same coin is the gift itself, the actual ability. So in just a few words, a spiritual gift is a spiritual, divinely given ability to serve God. So that's a simple definition that has to be unpacked as you go through it. The other thing to keep in mind as we go through this discussion is that spiritual gifts is one of those things that is very closely tied into the development of the local church in the scriptures. And so as we advance from, say, the book of Acts to later the book of Romans, the book of 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, you see that gift definition being fleshed out. And you see it becoming more and more evident and more palpable to understand how it works. So biblically, the gift is God's divine ability given to us in the context of the local church, which of course we understand is the local church is God's gift is where God's grace is manifested.
So Dave, you're kind of helping us get there already by couching that within the local church. I appreciate that emphasis. So we're not just talking about something that's very individualistic. How do you feel like you can be fulfilled? You can put your talents and abilities to work, but you're saying that happens in the context of the local body of Christ. Totally agree with that. Help us understand, though, in Scripture, in Ephesians 4, for instance, sometimes the gifts are referred to as the actual individuals, right? It says He gave the prophets, the apostles, the teachers, the evangelists, the individual with office that holds office in a local church. Today, for us, that's pastors, that's elders. That person is referred to as the gift there too. So help us understand then, is it the ability? Is it the individual himself? Is it both?
Yeah, that's a good question, Alex, too, because as you mentioned, that comes out of the book of Ephesians. Ephesians was a later written epistle. And so in the development of the church, if we could sort of do a time travel and jump back into that early church, that first church, as the church began to explain this to new believers or to teach this in local congregations, they became aware of the fact that God had given not only abilities, which is what we mentioned as the earlier definition, but people who were gifted with abilities. So as we think, the New Testament definition has, as it were, a growing, as it were, kind of sequential or a timeline on which it's being fleshed out. The New Testament church didn't understand all of these things either the first time. That's why we have 1 Corinthians chapters 12 to 14. So the difference between the gift as an ability and the gift as a person is that it's the later New Testament writings that point out the person. 1 Peter also does that, which is a much later epistle. And 1 Peter 4:10 gives us a really good definition that just summarizes the gifts as speaking and serving, but not the person. So it's looking at it through that timeline, through that growth of the local church.
So just changing directions just a tiny bit. Why is it important, if someone's listening, why is it important that someone identify their spiritual gifts?
Thank you, Scott, for asking that. And that kind of goes back to your first question about what made me get interested in it. As a pastor, as a church planner, I had to myself take time to understand and figure out my own spiritual gifts. So why is it important? Well, because of who we are as people called to serve, as people sent out to serve. I think this is really critical for our missionary colleagues, for our pastor, supporting pastors. We need to know who we are. We need to know what God has asked us to do. But in another sense, a way to help people understand the value of that. Not everybody's called to use a gift in a public ministry, but there's just some basic things. Fruitfulness, for instance, John chapter 10. When we bear fruit, we glorify the Father. Fruit isn't just character, it's also how our character affects other people, or really, I guess you could say, touches other lives. When we bear fruit, we're showing spiritual gifts. When we live by grace, we're showing spiritual gifts at work. And when we're living and practicing our gifts as God has designed us to do, it helps us understand how to obey the Spirit of God in our lives. Really, one of the challenges is, and I've tried to develop this a little bit in the book, there's a chapter dedicated to this. The challenge is always understanding that my gift could probably be used in more than one location. So say God calls me to be a teacher. He gifted me to be a teacher. I could teach probably different levels of people if I learned their needs or learned how to relate to them. I could teach maybe in a different culture if I learned and understood that culture. So gifts are so applicable in many different contexts that it helps us to understand that when I follow the Spirit's leading and I'm being fruitful and I'm obeying and living by grace, that God gets the glory, the church grows, and the ministry multiplies.
Dave, I appreciate that response. And circling back to something that I think is relevant when we tie in the topic of missions, one of the reasons I asked you about the distinction between offices and abilities that the people in those offices of ministry leadership have is because when it comes time to apply spiritual gifts on the mission field, I think a lot of people think that being a missionary is itself a spiritual gift. I think you can argue that it is in a certain sense. And yet one of the joys that I've had as I've gotten to know missionaries over the years is that they themselves come with a variety of backgrounds and a variety of inclinations. And some are very gifted in evangelism, some of them not as much so. And yet I've seen the Lord use them all in cooperation on teams together. And of course, there's also this fact that when we identify being a missionary as itself a spiritual gift, that may be true in some regard, but we don't want to slip into this pitfall of saying, well, that's not my spiritual gift. Therefore, I could never fill in the blank, whatever that is there, right? We don't want to use these things as crutches to say, if it's not my gift, then I'm not going to serve the Lord in a particular way, even if he's giving me an opportunity to do so and a need to meet. And so how would you answer the question of, is being a missionary a particular gift itself, or what spiritual gifts does a missionary need to have?
Let's pick up that question, though, Alex, as you were saying, what gift does a missionary need? And I tried to write this book out of my experience as a missionary. Matter of fact, I know that I've already gotten a little bit of feedback saying, these examples are interesting. It's all about Chile, So I've tried to base it on my own ministry, my own experience, and my own overseas context. What gift does a missionary need? Well, the simple answer to that question is, what gift doesn't a missionary need? Because if you're planting churches or developing leadership or mentoring new believers, you need to know how to work with people according to where they are in their Christian life. As a particular gift, though, if we go back to that point about people who are gifts to the church, I think it's pretty clear that in the early church and in practice today as well, God gives to the church gifted people who know how to lead the church right where it is at that moment. So, for instance, a new church needs to know how to evangelize. A new church needs to know how to disciple or how to correct or encourage or counsel. So those are going to be gifts that become very important to a missionary. You might call them gifts, say, of exhortation. On the other side, as the church grows, what's the emphasis? Teaching, preaching, training, leadership. So there, the missionary would best fit in if he is gifted or she is gifted in the area of, say, teaching, of pastoring, of leadership, or what the Bible calls governing. And so many different kinds of gifts can be applied to the role of the missionary. Actually, it's interesting that you mentioned this, and I didn't get a chance to mention it earlier, but that question also leads to what led us to Chile. And I don't have time to tell you about it now. We could save that maybe for another chat. But actually, we chose to go to the country of Chile because other missionaries were in the audience listening to us explain our testimony at our ABWE, what we now call NEMO, New Missionary Orientation. Back in those days, it was candidate classes. Mm-hmm. And they suggested to us the country of Chile because they thought we would fit in with their team and what was being done at that time because of our gifts.
You spend a whole chapter on spiritual requisites for knowing and using gifts. I thought this was extremely helpful, and also something that I hadn't seen before in other books that I've read or inventories that I've read on gifts. So what prompted you to emphasize this, the spiritual prerequisites for knowing and using your gifts?
Yeah, Scott, a good question. I kind of wrestled with that one and actually had some lengthy discussions with my editor, and she was helping me see that, sometimes it's hard you're trying to get under, kind of under the obvious. You're trying to get into motives and thinking and purpose. And I think that what I'm trying to make clear through that chapter on the prerequisites is that if we're driven or motivated for the wrong reasons to discover and use gifts, we may end up concluding that we have a certain gift that we don't. Mm. And why? Well, because we're kind of thinking I've got to be this way or talk that way or do this ministry, you know what I'm saying, or do that ministry. So if our motives are skewed, or if they're turning maybe to come back to what I want, then I become really wrongly motivated. So critical. Real quick, you can put it in 3 words: love, unity, faith. Those are 3 things that the Apostle Paul mentions in his letters that were conditions or prerequisites. Are you doing it out of love? Are you doing it in unity with the body? And are you motivated to do it by faith? So those are the things that I was trying to address.
That's good. So talk then about this idea of PRIZM, PRIZM. Obviously, it's an acronym. And what makes it different than the old spiritual inventory test that I remember seeing, growing up, or, we fill out the little check marks, and PRIZM is something different than that. How did you develop it? And what do you think about spiritual gift inventories in general? Are they helpful or are they not helpful?
Good question, Scott. So how did I develop it? I'll go there first. In our first church plant, we talked about spiritual gifts with our new believing congregation, basically asking them to identify, do you think you have this or that ability? There was a lot of fill-in-the-blank questions. It was a lot of open-ended questions. That was really, for most of those new believers, more confusing than helpful, not because it wasn't just, multiple choice, pick what you think is your ability, but because they were trying to figure out what the gift is before they could even decide if they had it. And so we began to work on some other ways to help them evaluate that. The open-ended questions, or at least for new believers, people who have been a believer for less than, say, 5 years, that's very difficult. The second thing that was part of how we developed this was that we saw that people looked at their own giftedness differently based on their personality. So, for instance, the introverted, the quiet, the steady, competent kind of person. I had been, and many of us have been through the training with Wayne Haston and a few of our other brethren on the DISC profile, the DISC profile. It talks about the 4 different leadership styles. There's the Taylor-Johnson temperament. There's a bunch of different temperament tests that help categorize personality styles. And so I think I began to realize people look at the gift, say, of serving with one particular focus. If they're a leader, they think that's insignificant. If they're a driver or phlegmatic was the word that was the old LaHaye test. If a person is an introvert, they think the gift of serving is insignificant, but for different reasons, because they think it's unimportant or it has no value. And so we began to realize that before we could help them define what their gift was, it was necessary for them to understand something basic about themselves. So the first letter of the PRIZM, PRIZM, stands for personality, or a personality profile. And we found one that was very simple and usable, and got permission to incorporate that into the book. So the first letter is personality. The second letter is reality. And I had to kind of define that because reality is way too vague, I understand. So it's the spiritual reality of the person. The R stands for their spiritual gifts. But to help make it memorable, I put the word reality there. So personality, reality. I stands for interests. Oftentimes, a person's spiritual gifts seem to be contrary to what they want to do. And the reason is because they're not necessarily willing to submit to the Spirit's leading in that area. So the next thing we talk about is their interests. And the way I define that is very basically, okay, if you knew that there was a need in your church or in your ministry or in the life of a fellow Christian, what would be your desire to help correct that? In other words, you're not talking about just, making things to match up with your desires. You want that church, that ministry, that person to grow. That's an interest. You see something, maybe he or she is not. The fourth letter is Z for zeal. And this one tries to put the person thinking long-term, get them out of the immediate, the what's right in front of them, and thinking long-term. And what is it that really is, and the most common word we use today, what is their passion? What is it they really want to see happen in the future through their service for the Lord? And then the final letter is M, and M actually, once again, gets them to look in the rearview mirror because it's standing for the word ministry experience, for the two words ministry experience. So it's PRIZM. The M is, what do I know about church life? What do I know about the Christian life? What don't I know? It's actually quite simple, that last letter, because that's easiest to just quick do a checklist on. So that's what the M stands for. Each of those came out of interviews with people, classes as we taught how to help people discover their spiritual gifts. And I didn't mention this, Alex and Scott, but the real point behind the whole book is I've taken actually almost 12 years of teaching on spiritual gifts, distilled it, and made it easy to read, I hope, and put that in a format that allows people to take and study the biblical concept of gifts, but apply it right from the day one. The first chapter has application questions. The second chapter has application questions. So it's a real, it's like a workbook, but with the teaching included.
I appreciate the fact that it has practical application, right? It would be hard to talk about this subject without actually challenging us to be willing to step out and do something, to use those gifts. And I appreciate what you're saying about what PRIZM means, because just as when we talk about missionary calling is not just one thing. It's this nexus of not only your internal impulses and desires and abilities, it's also the external need and the affirmation of others. And all of these things sort of have to converge. And usually what we end up doing in our nomenclature today is calling that a calling. Whether or not you hear an audible voice from God, and typically you don't, it's still that idea that the Lord is at work through these variety of factors. And I'm hearing some of those same themes in how you define PRIZM. Is it saying, yes, there's your gifts, there's the spiritual reality, but there's your personality, there's the scenario, the circumstances around you, the state of that church. There's all of these factors that feed into thinking through how has God gifted you to serve in this particular situation, which kind of leads me to another question. We mentioned this earlier, but I want to hear you speak to this specifically. People will say, that's not my gift, whether it's serving overseas, whether it's evangelism, whether it's acts of hospitality in the local church. They'll say, well, that's not my gift. How do you understand the connection between a person's gifting, but then also duties that everyone is called to undertake as Christians. And what's the line there between operating in your gifts and being negligent in other Christian duties in your mind?
That's interesting, Alex. Good question. I don't develop hospitality a lot in the book, but I do talk a lot more about evangelism. I think they're probably on the same par. We are commanded to evangelize, right? All believers. It is a spiritual or a Christian responsibility, but it's also a gift. There is a spiritual gift called evangelism or to evangelize. So how do I look at that? What I try to point out is Christians are not trying to copy one another. We're not supposed to be cookie cutter Christians. That is to say, rather than trying to say, I'm going to imitate this great famous person or that famous person or this method or that method, I try to help people find that they can probably, with the guidance of the Holy Spirit, create their own methods or their own practical, simple ways of exercising their gift. In other words, they take that gift, they get spiritual counsel, they discuss it with other Christians who know them, and then say, look, let's try to flesh this out in a practical way, rather than just assuming that the word evangelist or evangelism is done in this particular box. So a person who is gifted in evangelism will have unique fruit, will have a unique connectability with the unsaved, will have the persistence, will have the confidence. So the person that doesn't have the gift of evangelism, but yet partners with someone who does, not only has someone that they can learn from, but that also can help train them. And that's one of the points that we make in the book is everyone who has a certain gift should be training others with their gift. So you may not be the most gifted evangelist, but it is a command. How do you do it? You walk with and you go alongside with, you, as it were, are guided by someone who has that gift. And that's true of hospitality, of teaching. Parents, we're called to teach our children. I may be a terrible teacher in a classroom, but I will have to teach my children. How do I do that? I watch those who have it. What I'm trying to say is I kind of, as it were, if you could use the word, emulate those who have the gifts, even if they're not mine.
That's helpful. That's so helpful, actually, because discerning the gift can be a process. There's something else that I don't want to leave out here, though, and these are spiritual gifts. These are supernatural gifts. I think it's easy, especially once you start getting into quizzes and assessments, to start to think of these things as just natural capacities. And the way that I've heard it articulated, and I don't know whether or not you like this, David, this language, you can correct me on it if you like, but gifts of the first birth and gifts of the second birth, right? There's certain things that people are just born with in their natural state. Some people are just naturally more magnetic personalities, more extroverted, or more deeds oriented. But then there's specific ways in which those are refined or added to with completely new abilities and capacities through the filling of the Spirit that happens at conversion. And so we want to distinguish between those things. My question for you is more along the lines of, where does the visible supernatural element come in here? And we're within a Baptist missions agency, but we've got a variety of people across the spectrum listening to this program. Where do the charismatic spiritual gifts fit into this paradigm for you, convictionally, theologically? Is that something that you get into in the book? And how should we approach all of these gifts, whether they seem very extraordinary or whether they seem very ordinary? How do we recognize, well, they're all supernatural, even if they seem to result in very ordinary deeds of service coming out of a person's life?
Okay, well, I think there's two questions there, Alex, if I'm understanding you. So gifts of the first birth, gifts of the second birth is a term I actually have not heard. So I will have to read a little bit on that one, but I know what you're referring to. You have your, what would be talents is the word that people used to call them, versus your spiritual gifts. And I think that those two are definitely related. That's why in the PRIZM, the first letter is personality. And it will give the person a better handle on who they are from first birth, as it were, in their character or in their natural talents. That, though, shouldn't work against our spiritual gifts. What I'm trying to say is, in the book, as I pointed out, they all build one on the other. Actually, the term I call it is a gift blend or a gift mix. And so those two things play together. They work together. They are not contradictory. I think we need to understand that. That's why I think it's worth evaluating it. And there, in that case, the first point, I had to use the help of some very proven tests over the years to help identify personality. So you don't want to ignore that. Now, when we're talking about the gifts of charisma, or the gifts that are noticeable, you may call them maybe more powerful or more attention getting, I think we need to realize biblically that there are sign gifts, which were part of Revelation, actually at the point of God delivering his word all the way from creation to the formation of Israel, to the prophetic period, and then the life of Christ, and then wrapping it up with the apostolic period. Those sign gifts had one purpose: to communicate written revelation. Those gifts I do not believe are repeated today or necessary. But there are other gifts and gifted men and women that God gives the church that have certain abilities that do stand out. And those would be people who have the vision, the pioneer gifts, the skills, the willingness to face hardship, to overcome spiritual obstacles and spiritual resistance in their field of ministry. But those are not necessarily different gifts. That goes back to the prerequisites that I mentioned earlier. One of those prerequisites, Alex, is the measure of faith. It's spoken of in Romans chapter 12, where Paul says that we should use our gifts as God has given each according to the measure of faith that he has granted. The measure of faith is actually how much am I willing to believe God can use this? Or in other words, what kind of risks am I willing to take to fulfill my giftedness or to fulfill my role in the church? So they are, I guess you could say, necessary, evident. They are active, but they are still pastor, teacher, exhorter, governor. All those gifts. There's actually a list, I believe, of 10 active gifts, but in any combination that are necessary at the front end, so to speak, of the ministry of church planting or evangelism or missions. And those are the gifts that we would see today active in a more powerful way.
I want to circle back to what you said about risk, and that's helpful. I think so often we assume that if I'm operating in my gift zone, that I'm also going to be in my comfort zone. But oftentimes you're outside of your comfort zone. You're within your gift zone, but outside of your comfort zone. I think that middle ground there, that's the sweet spot. Think of the example of Moses. He was called to do something very uncomfortable. He was within his gift set, though, in that God had promised to be with him, to be with his mouth, right? Even though he was, he had the speech impediment, all these other things, that we look at the text and say, okay, he has reasons to waver in his confidence, way outside his comfort zone, but within the realm of God's blessing. But that measure of faith, just like you're saying, that doesn't mean that it's easy and that it is within your comfort zone. It actually means that to be operating in your spiritual gifts is to be willing to assume that risk and to believe that God is going to use you through that. I think that's an incredibly important point to make, especially in the context of missions. And maybe that's what I'd like to do as we kind of come in for a closing, Dave, is zoom out and think about that. I think many people listening to this are going to be encouraged and think, okay, I'm familiar with these concepts. This is good. I want to operate in my gift zone, and that's all well and good. But what are the consequences, in your opinion, if somebody doesn't understand their spiritual gifts, or better yet, if a church doesn't understand how God has gifted them with abilities and with certain proclivities to be used in certain types of ministries? You've been preaching and teaching on this for a number of years. This has come organically out of your ministry. And so paint for us a picture of what happens when we don't understand this, because I think it is critically important for us to grasp.
That's a good question, Alex, because I've been back here in the U.S. a little bit now in our home ministry for about 5 months. And every time I come back to the States, I see that the church in the U.S. is struggling with consequences of ministry emphasis or ministry convictions. Maybe you want to put it in that context, because emphasis is really a different level. What's the result of a church not understanding, using, or teaching on gifts? Well, I think you see it. I think you see people who are frustrated in the local church. I think you see people who are fruitless, who are believers 20, 30 years and maybe never led someone else to faith in Christ. You have churches where the ministry is just, you have that 80-20 rule, and it's maybe, 90-10. 90% of the work is done by 10% of the people, or 80-20. You have people overworked. You have churches that are stagnating, and you have pastors that are just totally frustrated. And so what happens if a church ignores this concept? Or what happens if they just don't understand it? Maybe they're trying to make it work, but they're looking at it either as just a physical ability or a human ability, or they're looking at it as something that's way off the charts that they don't understand. I think the result will be churches that don't fulfill their commission as a local church. They don't reach their own neighborhood because nobody wants to try to go out and break those barriers, nor do they send people to other parts of the world because they're unwilling to make the sacrifice and to have the vision and the faith and the obedience. So local churches that don't know how to work through this topic will eventually at some point begin to just turn inward, and eventually, even worse yet, perhaps just stagnate and shrivel up. And I think we have a real concern about that here in the U.S. right now. And that's not true just here. That's true around the world.
I think of so many people in small churches, in the types of churches that are planted on the mission field, where you've got a small team, you've got a lot of people maybe out on the periphery, but then there's always that core team that's smaller, and it's oftentimes the same people doing a lot of different things. And I can think of the burnout that happens there. And really a lot of the people in those situations, including missionaries, don't always have the luxury of thinking about what are my spiritual gifts and how can I only use those, because you're so busy putting out fires and just answering the need that's right in front of you. You don't always get to zoom out and think in that way. And yet I think you're right. The consequence is this just long-term fruitlessness. It's lots of activity, or maybe not so much activity, but it could be lots of activity without lots of output. And so I think that's a critical reminder. So remind us the name of the book, how they can get a hold of it, and how they can get in touch with you too, Dave.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, that really does concern me, and I hope that this book will in some way address that for our brethren. Well, the book's title completely is Spiritual Gifts: Identify and Use Them Through the Prism of God's Grace. It's built basically off of 1 Peter 4:10. Spiritual gifts, how to identify and use them through the prism of God's grace. We have a website right now. It's actually my blog, and that's where I have it at this point. It's called, the blog's name is missionarymiles.com. Kind of a creative, I hope, name there. missionarymiles.com. And there's a tab there where it talks about the coming soon, as it were, the publication of this book. The book is actually still right now in the hands of the press. I'm actually doing self-publishing, but there is a whole process of launching the book. It should be out, I'm hoping, by the very latest, the end of September, if not sooner.
Very good. Well, and maybe by the time this comes out, we'll be a little bit closer to that date. So, Dave, thank you so much for joining us and for all your faithful years of ministry with ABWE. And thank you for joining us as well. If you're a first-time listener or viewer, or you've been with us for years, we couldn't do this without you. If you're a believer in the mission of this show, you'd like to empower us to use our gifts here. Maybe we're gifted in this, maybe we're not, but you can be the judge. You can support us and partner with us at missionspodcast.com/support, or just head to that website and hit the support tab at the top. Remember, too, to leave a positive rating and review for this podcast in your platform of choice. That'll help get this content in front of other people that can be blessed and encouraged by it. Who knows, maybe somebody will discover it and tap into using their spiritual gifts, and God will use them in a significant way. You can be a part of that as well. If you have any comments or questions or suggestions for topics that we should cover, guests that we should interview, send those on over to alex@missionspodcast.com or to scott@missionspodcast.com. We would love to hear from you. And of course, as always, the Missions Podcast is a ministry of ABWE. To learn more about ABWE, go to abwe.org. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week here on the Missions Podcast. Take care.